That's why you see so many coverage analysis as independent contractors, because technically there's a lot of liability even for the coverage analyst, because you're saying bill this to Medicare, to a huge hospital system. We have, I would have professional insurance to a large amount, because then the corporation won't be liable for for what you put on the coverage analysis.
Welcome to On Research with CITI Program, your favorite podcast about the research world where we dive into different aspects of the industry with top experts in our field. I'm your host, Justin Osborne, and I appreciate you joining. Before we jump in, as a reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not designed to provide legal advice or legal guidance. You should consult with your organization's attorneys if you have questions or concerns about the relevant laws and regulations that may be discussed in this podcast. In addition, the views expressed in this podcast are solely those of our guest. Welcome back for Season 3 of On Research. I am very excited about the guests we have lined up for this season. I can't wait to learn so much more about this fascinating research industry from some really great people. To kick off Season 3, I met with Andra Popa, who you heard a clip from at the beginning. Andra is a graduate of Boston College and has a JD and LLM from Loyola. Andra was part of the first group to conduct Medicare Coverage Analyses, which has since become an essential element of research programs to ensure proper billing compliance. Andra owned a consulting firm for over 15 years and has published over 100 articles, written book chapters, and conducted workshops in compliance. Andra is now responsible for healthcare content at CITI Program. I had an in-depth discussion with Andra about coverage analysis, from detailing the process and requirements to explaining the why behind coverage analysis. This conversation is a great opportunity for anyone wanting to know more about this important topic. There are serious consequences tied to improper billing, so even if you're not super familiar with what a coverage analysis is, I definitely recommend the advice and guidance Andra gives. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Andra. Well, Andra, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course, of course. So to get started, do you mind telling us how you got into the research industry, a little of your background, and then what you're doing now?
Yes, I started working for my father, who was a physician. I worked for his practice starting when I was about 14,
Oh,
doing
wow.
hours, yeah, after school. And I would look at the billing and coding of the practice. That piqued my interest in healthcare, especially healthcare finance. And I studied it more in law school than my professor in my Medicare class, which was the only Medicare class at the time in the country. I was very lucky, very fortuitous. My professor asked me if I wanted to work with him on this new area called Medicare Coverage Analyses
Huh.
within clinical research. And I had always been interested in the sciences and biology, so I really love the interdisciplinary aspects of research.
So you just kind of, so you were in law school, you're studying this stuff, and then you were asked to sort of jump into this new world. So you're sort of at the beginning of this coverage analysis thing.
Yes, they really started in 2007. They updated the main national coverage determination that allows routine costs in clinical trials. And that's when, around the time that there was a large settlement with Rush University Medical Center with their
Uh,
clinical trials as well, they self-disclosed to the government. And
yeah.
my professor happened to be the person who conducted that settlement.
Wow. So did you help with that, or was that just sort of part of your education as you were coming up in the...
No, it was right before the settlement, and then
Oh,
he began his startup consulting firm, and then I joined.
okay. Okay. So then you did consulting with that group for a while.
I did for over 15, almost 17 years.
Okay. Very nice. Very nice. So then what are you doing now?
Yes, I recently joined CITI to start up their healthcare compliance content. They don't have any content related to healthcare compliance technically, so I've started up that vertical for CITI.
Well, I appreciate that background. That helps because, of course, our topic is coverage analysis, right? And this is sort of one of those topics that a lot of us in research have, you're kind of vaguely familiar with it, but it is a complicated, very niche area of research. So I wanted to ask you to, when we start off here, if you could sort of help us understand this, break it down, and sort of define terms. So I guess to start, what is coverage analysis?
Right. It's so every trial that's a research trial has items and services provided within the trial, and those will be listed in the protocol.
Hmm.
And a coverage analysis looks at certain items and services. Not all are billable. The coverage analysis will look at certain items and services. It'll itemize them in a spreadsheet, usually an Excel spreadsheet, and
Okay.
then it'll say how they're covered. If they're covered by the protocol in some way, or the clinical trial agreement, or the informed consent.
Okay, so when you say covered, you're talking about who will pay for the services, and how kind of walk me through that piece. So you're talking about coverage analysis being there's a document you mentioned or a spreadsheet, but this sounds like a process. It's not necessarily just a document, right? Kind of like similar to informed consent, right? Informed consent's more than the document, it's the process. So coverage analysis is a process. You're getting the information from the protocol you said and from the contract and other documents. Is that what you're going through the spreadsheet to identify if, say, for example, the sponsor in the protocol says they'll pay for a certain procedure or something? Is that all it is, or is it like what how involved is it?
Yes, it's similar to what you said. Before you perform the coverage analysis, there's several questions you have to ask
Okay.
before you start. Whether so the coverage analysis we perform to Medicare standards because usually the private insurance companies follow. However, each insurance company will have its own requirements, but technically we provide to Medicare. That's also the highest risk in terms of the False Claims Act, which is when you improperly bill to the government. So you ask yourself these three questions: whether a study meets Medicare's definition of a qualifying clinical trial that can support billing to a payer, which items and services are a routine cost. It's Medicare's definition, though,
Okay.
and then whether Medicare rules allow or limit coverage for the items and services. So then you look at these things called national coverage determinations and local coverage determinations, and those are
Okay.
all online. So
Okay. So you can find these national and the local.
yeah, national coverage determinations, you can find them
Okay.
online on the CMS site, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services
Okay.
website.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you asked those three questions. Back to the first question, you mentioned a qualifying clinical trial. How do you know if something's a qualified clinical trial?
Right there, it has to fall into certain categories. It has to be for a treatment, as just one example, or
Okay.
a type of qualifying device.
Okay.
So yeah, so it can't be, for example, generally for preventative care, you have to be very careful with those, as one example.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we were talking the other day about what meets Medicare's definition of a routine cost, and we were talking about what's the difference between conventional care and standard of care. And so, standard of care would be maybe one physician thinks this is how we treat the patient, or maybe a couple physicians think that, or maybe it's an accepted practice
Okay.
of treating a patient.
Yeah.
But conventional care would be something that Medicare or CMS approves of as a sort of a national standard. So it's
Okay. So
very
conventional care is national standard. So you could have, because yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So I always heard standard of care when I was working at a hospital, research hospital, and conventional care. You said.
typically provided absent a clinical trial. That would be conventional care.
Okay, so you could have standard of care because it's best practice and whatnot. Some standard of care stuff could be conventional care, but it's not necessarily conventional care if it's standard care.
Exactly. And
Okay.
you're looking, when you do your coverage analyses, you have to find what is the conventional care.
Gotcha, gotcha. That's what you're assessing when you're doing filling out the spreadsheet and determining how charges are supposed to be billed, basing
It's
it
a
off
small
conventional.
aspect.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a small aspect of it, but
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
thank you for going through those uh, differences because that is I don't people throwing those terms out if you're not into this process and you're not actually working on the coverage analysis, I could see where there could be confusion with that.
Yeah, and it's this is where it becomes really interesting for people that like interdisciplinary work because so the items and services that are conventional care are covered as part of routine costs of a qualifying clinical trial, with the caveat that all Medicare rules apply. So
Okay.
Medicare is probably more than 500,000 pages. So it's well more than that. So it's, and they don't edit their, their work. So you have a lot to apply. But
Okay.
this is where it gets really interesting. And it's so where do you find this conventional care? How do you support it? There are a variety of things you can look at,
Yeah.
including the national guidelines for cancer care. There's
Okay.
also professional guidelines related to radiology, for example.
Okay.
How often should someone get an MRI if they're having cancer care? How often
Sure.
do you test if the tumor is receding or not? Those are
Yeah.
questions. So it's actually very interesting. It's very exciting to do coverage analysis because of this.
Well, I'm very happy that there are people like you who find this exciting because it is super it seems super complicated from where I'm sitting. So it sounds like there's the science and then there's a little bit of the art to this too, right? Trying to figure out exactly how to
There
yeah.
is, we use a variety of sources, and they can be quite current as well. They're subscription services, and also the pharmacopedias. So I read those very carefully to find. So you'll see some medications. It tells you how they're cleared by the liver or the kidney, and that might affect the clinical trial and what
Yeah.
types of blood tests you give. For example, if you need to test kidney function or liver function. So all of that information is. There are other sources that are more current than others, but
Okay.
yeah, but the tried and true ones are truly the national standards or the professional standards, the professional guidelines. For example,
Okay.
radiology or cardiology
Yeah.
also has excellent professional guidelines. Maybe it helps to think of a real world example would be the protocol really has a schedule of the treatments. So it might say every every week you have a chemotherapy infusion, say every week on Thursday.
Yeah.
So the your coverage analysis will have that listed. It'll say, it'll list the months, and then say for 6 months you have, and it'll mark, a signifier to say, well, on this day every week you have this treatment. And then resulting from the main treatments, you have a schedule of if it's a tumor, there might be imaging, and then there'll also be blood tests, blood work that
Okay.
might be only to investigate the drug, for example, if that's what you're investigating, or it might be blood work to test your health because you're given an agent that is toxic. So,
Okay.
well, that's kind of a case study.
So
So
then in each one of those things, you have to determine every procedure. This I'm just envisioning this document. You're sort of checking off how this is supposed to be essentially billed.
yeah, and I really imagine the patients when I perform a coverage analysis. I think about them and I think about the workflow, of their care. And the problem is if you do not perform a coverage analysis, then technically the charges arising from the medical center that
Yeah.
might arise within the context of a clinical trial that aren't related to what the sponsor's picking up. Those charges, if they're not analyzed, will end up being billed to the patient. So that's why it's
Mm,
important to perform these coverage analysis in addition to the legal liability.
absolutely. Yes, and we'll get to the legal liability because I want to ask about that side of things, but just to sort of back up to this process that you're talking about, and I
Yeah.
appreciate you saying that about putting this sort of patience in this, right? Because this is not just, I mean, this is very detail oriented, data driven, looking up justifications and spreadsheets and all that stuff. But there are obviously real world consequences for these things. But who you were talking about the multidisciplinary aspect of this process in general. Who's doing this typically? Who's actually the one? I mean, you were doing it as a consultant and as an attorney, but if
Yeah.
you're looking at a hospital, doing research, who's actually typically doing coverage analysis?
There are a wide range of skills involved with coverage analysis. So it could be, it's more the characteristics of the person.
Okay.
There could be research coordinators who not in their, they don't have two jobs. Maybe they have experience as a research coordinator and then they move into coverage analysis. But
Yeah.
not all research coordinators are comfortable with billing practices. You want someone who is comfortable with uncertainty and with also a wide range of disciplines. So they have a understanding of biology and of medical terms, medical terminology,
Hmm.
some billing experience, billing and coding, although they don't have to have that, just a sensitivity for the revenue cycle and
Okay.
a willingness to learn about it. And also not to, because there's so many nuances in coverage analysis and the medical institutions, the healthcare entities, they each have their own perspectives and their level of risk tolerance. So it can't be someone who doesn't have any give in their personality. You have to
Yeah.
be willing to be accepting of other people's opinions because there's several layers to the coverage analysis. One of them is the conventional care, but you also look at then the Medicare portion, and that could exclude, even if it's conventional care, it might not be covered, or so many different steps. And so it has
Yeah.
to be someone who's detail oriented but easygoing at the same time, which is hard.
Yes. Yeah, type A and B. It's this is yeah, it's a mix. No, that's helpful actually. I think that's helpful for folks because trying to either if you're trying to figure out who's going to do this at your institution or who should or maybe you're interviewing people for this kind of thing. I mean, it's nice to hear like you said the qualifications. It's not that there is a job like a specific job title that fits this role best. It's more about the individual, it sounds like.
It truly is. And the most fun I've had working in coverage analysis with people has been where they obviously these need to get done in a timely manner, but also where they're comfortable asking questions about the gray areas and having a quick chat about them and seeing what they think. I always really enjoyed those conversations where I certainly don't know everything, and I would go back and ask my colleagues,
Yeah.
my consulting colleagues, and say, "What do you think about this? And what about this approach?"
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it was uncharted territory, and we were the first group to conduct them, so they were interesting academic questions.
I bet.
Yeah, so they're just a wide range of people, really. You can have an accounting background or billing background or nutrition, physical therapy, uh,
Okay.
yeah, pharmacy,
Yeah.
law. So it's,
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay, so that helps, I think, just kind of starting from the top and thank you for explaining terms and defining things and walking us through this process. This is a big process, it seems like. From the like, why are we doing it? Why does it matter? Before we get into the potential ramifications if something goes wrong or whatever. Can you kind of help explain, is this a regulatory requirement? Is this just best practice? Like where's the requirement coming from? Just so people understand when is this triggered? You know what I mean?
Sure. It's it's technically not required to do a coverage analysis, but you will bill incorrectly if you don't do a coverage analysis, especially if it involves a federally funded trial, and then also with Medicare, if there's Medicare involved,
Yeah.
then you have a huge compliance risk of liability related to the False Claims Act, which is a
Okay.
very old requirement. It's from the Civil War. All it says is that you can't provide inferior goods to the government and then get the federal money in return. So the inferior goods
Ah.
in this case are not donkeys and mules and horses, but yeah, but the inferior goods are related to you're submitting false claims to the government.
Ah.
So
Okay, that's so interesting. So, is it your experience that the instance that you cited earlier that sort of started this whole thing, was that the first time that False Claims Act was used in this manner?
they made a self-disclosure, so they were not approached by the government. They approached the government with their findings.
Okay. Okay. So if you make, well, help me understand that. If you self-disclose, then are you
Mhm.
saying that False Claim Act doesn't apply?
It does,
Okay.
but it's technically not the government coming after the entity. They stated we found some errors, and you sort of don't get to the False Claims Act in some ways. You just say we found some errors and we're willingly paying back the money. and
Okay.
and we have a compliance system in place now. We're doing coverage analyses.
Okay.
We have consultants.
Okay. I
So
got you.
technically, you don't reach that conversation because it shows a better compliance program when you do a self-disclosure, when you don't wait for them to find.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. So it sounds like from a requirement standpoint, you said it's not technically a requirement, but it sounds more like insurance almost, right? Like it's there to sort of protect you because if you don't have it, then your risk goes way up, it sounds like.
Yeah, the charges just won't be allocated properly without a coverage analysis. So it'll affect not only your compliance risk, but there's a possibility of course, related to compliance, you can double bill, you can bill improper claims to the government. The sponsor, you might lose money on a clinical trial. So it's also for the financial strength of the institution. It behooves them to have a coverage analysis ready when you're negotiating with the sponsor, and
Yeah,
have that ready and know how much the items and services will cost you, and then negotiate, because you don't want to also lose money on clinical trials either.
right. That's a good point because this process that you're talking about really is, it should be done up front, right? Like, this is a front end process for starting up a trial because you really shouldn't, you're saying, finalize a contract or an agreement. I mean, it sort of goes along with the budget, right? Like you need to be doing this in tandem when you're negotiating a budget so you know how much to charge.
That's right. When I first started, those documents that you're referring to, so there are three core documents. The budget is usually included in the clinical trial agreement.
Hmm.
And so the budget refers to what the sponsor, and again, that could be a pharmaceutical company, a medical devices company, or it could be something else.
Yeah,
But whoever is paying for the study. But yes, so there's that agreement you have with the sponsor and the entity. And then you have an informed consent.
mm,
And then you have a protocol, which is a protocol refers to what the clinicians will, how they execute the plan of care related to the clinical trial, how they conduct the trial.
right.
It has to be scientifically valid, right? You can't just, you have to have a plan of care and
Right.
a schedule of events. And yes, all of those documents have to match, because when I first started, truly, if they could, if, sometimes they couldn't even find those documents, but all of the terms have to match. So
Yeah.
if something says it's free in the informed consent, it has to be properly budgeted within the budget, within the clinical trial agreement. The
Yeah.
protocol can't say otherwise. Either usually it doesn't have financial terms. Sometimes the protocol items and services don't match the budget. You have to make sure everything is captured properly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, and I know I've worked with institutions myself where they have a reconciliation process. It's done by somebody different than the person doing the coverage analysis, but their job, essentially part of their job, was to make sure, to your point, that all these documents match. So, sometimes the protocol will have a sponsor that says they'll, for like subject injury, the sponsor will say they'll pay for it, and then the consent says that the patient's responsible for it, right? And so that reconciliation process is vital, it sounds like. And you're saying again, just to think about the fact that coverage analysis is so tied into the entire research process and the study process, all that stuff goes together, right? Like you can't do an adequate coverage analysis if you're not ensuring that all these documents are matching.
No, you truly can't complete the analysis without all of those documents.
Yeah,
And it really highlights the multidisciplinary nature of the field, because you have people in finance involved, negotiations, you have the pharmaceutical clinicians who are creating the protocols, or
yeah,
the clinicians that are creating these protocols. Informed
okay,
consent is more legal. So even just by those documents, you can see right away that the analyst is very multidisciplinary. And a great way to approach it is think of it as a team. So not everyone has to have the answers in all the areas. You can, if you can't, hire someone without that expertise, maybe people in different departments can help in coding, and someone in legal maybe, or someone in finance.
yeah.
Uh,
That's really helpful. So then you have this. Okay, I want to follow this through. So
yeah.
you have this document, this analysis of the coverage analysis, right? Like it's the spreadsheet or whatever. And say you've completed that analysis, the study has started. What in terms of documentation, there's some sort of documentation of this, right? And then how does that, I assume that that follows through. Can you kind of walk us through the life cycle of this? How does this follow and find its way to billing and revenue cycle and all those teams, right?
Yeah. And as you mentioned, there should be a process where the study doesn't start. Some studies don't require a coverage analysis. For example, maybe no participants are enrolled at that entity.
And there's no bills involved with those kinds of studies, right?
Right. And I've been a PI, for example, on a study where I study the efficacy of compliance materials because I'm sort of analyzing that, but it was considered exempt. But that's an example of I look at how are the materials designed? Does that help the compliance aspects? But that's still
Sure.
technically a trial, but there's no, I'm not billing Medicare or
Yes, yes. And to your
just
point, you would identify whether or not something needs a coverage analysis, going back to those three questions you talked about at the
yeah,
beginning, right? Like, is this a qualifying clinical trial and all those other things, right?
exactly correct.
Okay.
And so you would have to have some type of system to capture that, which ones would need one, which ones wouldn't.
Sure.
And then in the ones that did need them, I know this is a little bit tough to say, but you should never start the trial without the coverage analysis if it's needed.
Right.
So that IB review should technically be held. I always suggest that because it's a nice incentive to start the trial to get a coverage analysis first.
Sure,
So
sure.
it'll go there first, and it also has to go to all the other departments. So if it's radiation is involved, it has to go to radiation, all the different committees. So it's part of the process of IRB approval. And then so the coverage analysis will go to the revenue cycle team for review after it's completed
Okay.
before the trial starts, hopefully. The revenue cycle team means, they're the people, they do the coding, and the billing is what goes out. And
Okay.
technically that's in your electronic medical record system.
Okay. Yeah.
And they reference the coverage analysis to guide them how to direct the charges. So they can place edits within the patient. They'll trace it to the actual patients enrolled or the participants enrolled in the trials on their record.
Gotcha.
And then
Yeah.
the third MRI is covered by the sponsor. So we're not going to bill Medicare, but the fourth MRI goes to Medicare.
Gotcha. And so that source of truth, that's why thinking through this as a process, that's why that documentation of the analysis is so important. So revenue cycle has that, and so they can check against that anytime a bill goes out or goes through the system, right, for patients. Because you would have to have some sort of source of truth, right, to go back to.
Exactly. And any patient that is in a clinical trial should be flagged within the system. And then they'll have this pathway that's specific to them as related to the coverage analysis.
Yeah, and I
And
mean, again, when we're talking about pathways, I'm just thinking there are a handful of EMRs out there, electronic medical record systems and whatnot, right? And not to go through the differences, but there are differences in them, right? So, and I know just through experience and talking to other folks in the industry, some have like there's preferences. Some people like one over another, but it doesn't sound to me that the EMRs themselves necessarily have like a solution for this. It really is every single institution or hospital has to manage this process in a way that fits within their revenue cycle team and how they bill and how they use the EMR. Because not even, I know in certain EMRs they have, research modules and those kinds of things. And if you're not, they're not all the same, I guess is my point, right? So you really have to figure out your process individually.
yes, absolutely. And you bring up a great point that in my consulting work, I did find there you have to be very careful with the EMRs and always audit the EMRs and not rely too heavily on them in the sense of calculations of coding in particular.
Oh, okay.
I noticed in my consulting practice, there was one instance where the EMR was upcoding things accidentally. And it,
Hmm.
it was mainly because the EMR is again built by an interdisciplinary team. You have computer programmers
Yeah.
who code, and then you have compliance. It has to be compliant with rules and regulations. And then you have coding is also highly specialized. And in this sense, coding and medical coding is very specialized. So you have these three disciplines. And what I noticed was that the EMR was upcoding because there's a term called bundling where some services are considered just one. So an example is a complete blood count medical lab
Okay.
tests a variety of things like your red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. But this program was separating all of those out. So it was saying each one of the components is an individual test,
Oh.
which is logical by the standards of a computer programmer. Because I spoke with them, they're like, we don't understand. It's one test, one, which makes sense. But in billing, in coding,
Yeah.
it's just considered one test. It's all together as a complete blood count test.
Uh,
So by separating them, they were increasing the charge of the visits. So because it was saying that, well, we ran all these tests, it was very complicated.
yeah.
The
That's
your
interesting.
visits are billed according to the complexity. So it was increasing complexity. So that's a great example where, as you
Yeah.
say, you can't quite rely entirely on your EMR. They are very different. You have to see what works for you.
Yeah, that's good. That's good advice. Well, and the other, I know another example that I always ran up against in terms of complicating this more was mixed visits, right? Where you had people come and patients coming in and how to manage the EMR so that the patient that was seen for a clinical purpose and a research purpose in the same visit, that becomes complicated to make sure that everything is split out the way it should.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And technically, what should happen is any item and service not on the coverage analysis should be then sent back into the main healthcare entity's non-clinical research billing flow. But again, as we talked about, sometimes the coverage analysis doesn't have all the items and services, or if that doesn't capture everything within, it might accidentally then be built improperly. So
Yeah.
it's how it, but technically they should know right away because it's not in the coverage analysis. They should know right away that for a different purpose.
Yeah, yeah. Again, assuming that it's done properly and all that stuff is there. So, all right, so that's a good segue. So let's talk about the sort of the downer side of this. What what happens, I guess? You have say you have a coverage analysis, but at some point the process failed and bills are sent out incorrectly. You either overbill, double bill, whatever. Say that happens at your institution. Why does it matter? I mean, can you just kind of, oh, we caught it and we'll give the money back to the sponsor or to Medicare insurance or to the patient, right? And kind of move on. But what does that trigger?
Yes, it's very serious if that is found. The and it depends again on the fact pattern, but if you find that you've improperly billed Medicare, the really on a trial, the best thing to do is to just take a breather, and for that trial, it's just stop billing just until you can get everything proper again to see what happened, and make a record of any education, any corrective action plans, any root cause analyses,
Okay.
and any contact at all you have with the government entity. And it's better if it's all under privilege of your general counsel or outside counsel. You can hire outside counsel, consultants, get your audit team involved to see what happened. Sometimes you have to consult a variety of people. It's very important to not assume that someone is guilty of something. So you have to be extremely careful to make sure that they're in, that it's not an innocent person that you're blaming or
Sure.
like that.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like from what you've described and explained in this process, as complicated as it is, it doesn't sound that hard to make a mistake, right? Like it sounds like it's, reasonable that a bill could go out to the wrong party if you're not hyper focused on this.
That's right. And the most important thing to do is to make sure that there are controls in place where you can find these instances where perhaps the compliance program breaks down,
Mm,
and just to try. I think is the biggest. If the government sees that you're trying, that you do have a coverage analysis, and that you caught errors in the system,
Yeah.
and can speak with your counsel, speak with outside counsel if needed about whether you need to self-disclose. It depends on the fact pattern, but the most important you can do, and the timeline of reporting that and things like that. But
Okay.
the most important thing you can do is document attempts at compliance and try to
Yeah.
have policies and procedures, true education, auditing and monitoring.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. This all makes perfect sense. Obviously, the consequences of this sort of overpayment, double billing, all that stuff is all over the map. But I guess just to dig a little bit deeper in the consequences area, what I guess in your experience, what have you seen? But can you kind of help people that aren't really familiar with how dire the consequences could be with this? Like, kind of walk us through that side.
Yes, it's very serious financial consequences. We've talked before about not losing money with clinical trials, and that's
Mhm.
actually important for maintaining. It's surprising, but it's actually important for maintaining the not-for-profit status because
Ah,
you can't, if you're not making money, you're giving things away for free, and that plays into your not-for-profit status. So
ah,
there are a lot of areas of expertise that are touched by these clinical trials, and the biggest one, of course, is the financial consequences of the False Claims Act.
yeah.
The trebles damages, which means it multiplies times three. And if anyone can think of, if you can imagine an oncology trial, for example,
Mhm.
if you can think of all the items and services that they consume during their treatment, all of that, imagine that multiplied times three, for example.
Wow.
So it's the penalties can range, to millions to hundreds of millions to close to a billion, and they have
Wow.
consequences on the staff of the hospital, on your eligibility for Medicare, depending on what happened. The hospital might have to sell
Wow.
assets, so it's extremely important for the financial health of the institution and to keep financially healthy. So this is not a cost center.
Yeah,
It's
no.
quickly say compliance is a cost center, but it truly saves, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, that was a great sales pitch. Gosh, I think you just scared everybody listening to this. I mean, but that is to your point. I mean, that is, and I think I mean, if you're interested in this stuff, anybody can Google past instances of
And
this and see what happened.
yeah, and they're ongoing. You can really go to the Office of Inspector General. It's called the OIG,
Hmm.
and they have press releases. The Department of Justice has press releases, and you can see. So there are different things that trigger the False Claims Act that your listeners might want to be aware of. It's not only improper billing, but there was a recent case where and a settlement for it also occurs if there's scientific misconduct and there's federal funds involved. There was one recent one that the CEO of a startup pharmaceutical company, they misrepresented their thesis and their findings and their graphs, but
Wow.
their foundation of their company was based on this thesis. So,
Ah,
but they were billing the government, and that nullifies the things. Also have to be medically necessary. So if something isn't efficacious, it's not medically necessary if it doesn't do anything.
yeah.
So they that triggered the False Claims Act as well. There could also be security violations if you have a contract with NASA or a government entity where you don't have proper security to secure the records that you're
Wow.
conducting the research on. So
Okay.
all of these things you have to be aware of, not
Yeah.
just the coverage analysis part.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful actually. That's a really nice
Yeah.
list of things to make sure you're covered against.
Yeah. And also, it's extremely important because you want to have a viable clinical trial program. And unfortunately, viability does require proper accounting and proper financial maintenance. So you need to make sure that you're, as we stated, you're making money on these trials because otherwise it's not a viable program. So for all these reasons, it's definitely a good practice.
Absolutely. No, that is super helpful. I really appreciate you kind of going through that side of it. So it's interesting because you talked at the beginning about your experience in this coverage analysis sort of, it's an industry, right? There's a lot of options out there, a lot of consultants, a lot of companies that are able and willing to help out institutions with this process. But where do you see, you've seen this almost from its birth, right? Where do you see this industry going? Is this going to get more complicated, less complicated? Like, where do you see this thing going?
There's a lot of pressure in the industry currently to minimize the time spent on coverage analysis,
Okay.
almost to a point where it's hard to complete a coverage analysis that's accurate. So it's going in that direction, definitely.
Mhm.
However, at the same time, it's such a complex field that it's difficult to cut corners. So there are things that will stay the same and there are things that will change. Even at the early stages, people were trying to create computer programs to create coverage analyses. Not AI, but a program to
Yeah.
software to create that. But
Do you think that's where this is going? Do you think that there's going to be eventually a software solution that could do this, or is there too much nuance? And I mean, I'm just thinking about how could a software system dig through recent oncology trials to provide as justification to get something approved for Medicare? I mean, these people are smarter than me, but do you see that going in this direction, or how do you see it?
it's possible that portions of the coverage analysis could be analyzed
Mm,
separately. And you had a guest on the show who talked about just creating the grids for coverage analysis. You
right.
still need someone who understands the computer and who understands coverage analyses to review it.
Yeah.
But it's possible that different aspects could be then put together and overseen by a human. That's possible. But no, there is just pressure in the industry to make the time spent on these much smaller.
That is interesting. And again, I understand from the industry side why there's pressure to make the coverage analysis shorter, right? Like everything else. But it'll be interesting, I guess, to see how either technology, AI in some fashion can help with this, or I mean, to your point, it seems like when it comes down to whether or not it's covered, how you get there, there's an art to it, but at the end of the day, there is an answer, right? It's not, can you disagree on a coverage analysis? I guess that's
Oh, very much. Yes, very much.
okay.
So. We've very much so. That's why my favorite parts of my consulting work were where we do have true discussions, like academic discussions about the coverage. And also, the entity will have its own interpretation. The clinician might have their own outlook as well as to the conventional care, because again, we're not the clinician, we're just suggesting these materials to them. But yes, absolutely, the entities
Well,
can say we disagree. We need
yeah, no, sorry, that kind of brings me to who is authorized, or I guess at an institution, is there an individual that has the authority to say, this is how I want the coverage analysis to be, right?
usually it'll be because I worked in consulting, usually it's the lead consultant or the attorney working with the entity or maybe their counsel or the compliance officer or everyone
Okay,
together with someone with knowledge of the government standards and the legal risk. So you have to make a judgment call on some of the coverage analyses. And
gotcha.
that's why you see so many coverage analysis as independent contractors, because technically there's a lot of liability even for the coverage analyst, because you're saying bill this to Medicare, to a huge hospital system. We have, I would have professional insurance to a large amount. It won't cover $1 billion, but it was a large amount of, it has to be a large amount of professional insurance, as all auditors have. But that's why you see independent contractors, because then the corporation won't be liable for for what you put on the coverage analysis.
That makes sense.
You're setting their electronic medical billing software to bill at certain intervals that you're telling them to.
Right, right.
Tell them the wrong answer, you become liable. It's very important to work with people you trust when you're a coverage analyst, but the entity has to decide on its own what risk they'll accept. There are different
Yeah,
levels. So there isn't really one person, and the clinician might also have an opinion as well as to the
yeah.
coverage analysis.
That makes sense. I guess what I'm thinking is it, because every institution is different and they have to decide, to your point, their risk level that they're comfortable with. It's not set up in a way that a clinician could come in after you do a coverage analysis and say, I disagree. change it to this, and then that settles it, right? It's there should be either a committee, a group, or somebody that is the final say to say, no, no, this, I hear you, but based on everything else, this is what we should go with.
Well, yes, especially if you consider if the physician is an employee of the hospital, which more and more are now, an employee can't decide the risk level of a
Makes
of
sense.
a healthcare entity, because if you do have fraud on their decision, then they're putting the whole institution at risk. And
Yeah.
so they can't, no, they can't make that independent decision. It is a very interesting field, but it is a very a high liability as well, just to perform the coverage analyses.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's helpful. That's actually really helpful to think through. Again, just there's so many pieces to this process. Well, this is fantastic. I really appreciate you walking through this complicated process and talking to us about this.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to speak with you. Thank you.
Well, we're back. I'm still sitting here with Andra, and we're going to start our same team segment. So I know we all get bogged down in our day-to-day job responsibilities, but I believe that those of us that stay in this research industry do so because we really believe in making a difference and that our individual efforts have a larger impact on, the health and well-being of others. So can you give an example or an experience from your career that ties back to this idea that we're all on the same team?
Yes, I became really interested in children's health care, and I volunteered extensively at a local children's hospital in Chicago, the Lurie Children's Hospital. And there I really saw, because I was in this industry for so long and research for so long, I really saw the life cycle of chemotherapy products,
Mhm.
of different types of treatments that they provide children. So it was interesting to see that trials that I worked on as a coverage analyst or within an IRB setting then were used on the children that I just helped create art activities for them. But it was very interesting to see it in fruition, to see that treatments can help them.
Yeah. So you got to see like the other side. I mean, a lot of us on research get to see the science and the business and the all these sort of details to run a trial, but it's difficult because those kind of people, administrative operations folks, typically don't see the patient side of it. Like, how does this play out in real life? So you got to see these trials in action, so to speak.
Yes, once the items were approved, I saw, once the approval came through, because I've one of the benefits of sticking with something for a long time is you do
Mm.
see hopefully an improvement in the care. So from 2007 or 2008 to 2020, for example, you do see changes, and then medicines being approved. And
Yeah.
I saw that as well I was able to shadow an oncology physician also at a university where I helped with their program. And
Yeah.
there you see it as well. The pharmacy there was embedded within the clinical unit. So I could hear conversations about the medicines that they were using. And I knew I didn't tell them, but I knew I had worked on some aspect of the trial,
Oh, that's
um,
cool.
before it was approved for use. And
Yeah.
really it changed my life as well. I was diagnosed with something as well when I in my arm. It was called a sarcoma, and it's usually for pediatric patients. And say 30 years ago, the treatment was amputation. So my,
Oh my
amputation
goodness.
of your arm. But through clinical trials, it was one of the first clinical trials that they used, was just they learned that if you just remove the the issue, then you get better. I mean, it depends what stage you are, but so in my own life, it
Yeah.
it affected me, greatly. So it was really incredible having all these experiences where you see. I'd recommend to anyone working within, if possible, because especially if you're around an IRB, clinicians. I asked an IRB member, do you mind if I shadow you? And I ended up shadowing him for 2 years.
Oh my goodness, that's awesome.
Yeah, with an oncology clinic. I published a paper. And then, so, which is, I attended the radiation oncology board meetings. It was
Yeah.
extremely enriching. I'd really recommend for anyone, even for a few hours, if you have time, if you're in the IRB setting or in the coverage setting or in anywhere within research, just to go out and be in a clinical setting for a few hours or a few days, whatever you
Yeah.
can.
That's
And
great advice. And thank you so much for sharing. That is an awesome experience that you've had to kind of see how this industry has impacted. I mean, obviously you personally, which is amazing.
it's now I can, pick up my children and things like that. It
Oh,
changes your life really to
absolutely.
you do see progress, and I know there's so much negativity and there's so much going on in the world with this fires recently, but you do have some positivity, you do have progress in science, and
Yeah.
it changes people's lives.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, Andrea, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all this and part of your story and for educating us. This has been extremely enlightening on this coverage analysis process.
Okay, thank you again for having me. It's just been a real joy, and I love speaking about coverage analyses, so thank you.
Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe to On Research with CITI Program. If you enjoyed this episode, you may be interested in other podcasts in the CITI Program universe, including On Campus and On Tech Ethics. You can listen to all our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other streaming services. You should also review our content offerings regularly as we continually add new courses, subscriptions, and webinars. Thanks for listening.